Okay, so good evening, everyone. I, Adya Pandey, welcome you all to today's PSPO webinar. Today's speaker, Ms. Maansi Gupta, is a PhD scholar in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at IIT Delhi. She has done a B.Tech in Mechanical and Automation Engineering, followed by post-graduation in Operations and Finance. She has keen interest in using data and mathematical models to suggest reforms in the public sector. Her doctoral research is focused on the Indian judiciary, which includes measuring and analyzing the performance of Indian courts and suggesting data-driven reforms. Today, she will be presenting her work on the efficiency measurement of Indian high courts using DEA, a policy perspective. Would request Ms. Maansi to please begin with the presentation now.
Thanks, Adya. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it visible?
Yes, Maansi, it's visible.
So, hi everyone. Thanks, Adya, for the introduction. So, as she mentioned, I'm a research scholar in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at IIT Delhi. Today, I'll be presenting on efficiency measurement of Indian high courts using DEA, a policy perspective. I'll be starting with a brief introduction and motivation regarding the study, followed by the objectives, the models that we developed, the results from the models, their policy implications, and then conclusions. A quick overview regarding the Indian judicial system. So we have a quite extensive Indian judicial system that has a pyramid-like structure. We have the Supreme Court of India at the apex of the structure, followed by high courts and district courts. High courts are, they exercise jurisdiction over a state or a group of states and union territories, and they have superintendence over the lower courts, also known as district courts in those states. In case of district courts or lower courts, we have districts and subordinate courts for civil cases and sessions and magisterial courts for criminal cases. Coming to the current status of the Indian judicial system, there are almost 47 million cases that are pending in Indian courts as of now. Of these, we can see normally almost 87% are pending in district courts alone, followed by 13% in high courts, and a very small nominal number of 0.0001% in the Supreme Court of India. Looking at the age-wise categorization of the pending cases, we'll see that in case of district courts, nearly over 10% of the cases are pending for more than a decade, and in case of high court, that number is almost 23%. So one would ask, why do we need to study judicial performance? Like, what ends would that serve? Firstly, there are a lot of issues that are plaguing the Indian judicial system as of now. I think the most commonly heard one, I'm sure everybody has heard this one, is that Tariq pe Tariq, from the famous movie. You just keep getting dates and nothing is resolved. In fact, people live decades in prisons and their criminal cases are just proceeding through the system. And eventually, after years of spending in the jail, they are declared as innocent. Similarly, in case of civil cases, also especially property disputes, it takes generations after generations to get any resolution from the courts. Apart from this, you can say that the courts are highly congested. There are very high pendency levels. I mean, almost every other week, there's an article in the newspaper that is stating the current level of pendency and how to solve those pendency levels. There is a delay in resolving cases. There is a lack of uniform performance metrics to measure the performance of the judicial system. There are lack of reforms that are based on that have some sort of quantitative backing. And lastly, we have lack of judicial resources. These may be in terms of human resources such as judges and staff, or it may be in terms of other infrastructure facilities such as courtrooms, IT infrastructure, and financial resources. So what do these issues lead to? They lead to poor economic growth in the country and they affect the public. How? It reduces investments in the country, it reduces credit in the country, it reduces agricultural output, increases poverty rates, and it also enhances the propensity to engage in criminal activities. So if a case is taking a very long duration, people are more prone to, to a career in criminal offenses. So this is what we'll be discussing today, measuring the performance of Indian high courts using DEA and trying to come up with policy insights from our study. So a typical way to measure the judicial performance or the performance of courts or even judges is clearance rate. A clearance rate is defined as the number of cases that are disposed during a given time period divided by the number of cases that are instituted during the same period. So in a way, if you think of the court system as sort of a factory, it's basically your output upon input. In a country like India, where there's a high pendency where there are high pendency levels also, we need to ensure that our clearance rates are above 1. So in addition to resolving cases that are being instituted during the year, we want to ensure that every year we are clearing a proportion of the backlog as well. But what happens with clearance rate is it is not taking your resources, your staff, your judges into consideration. We try to incorporate that into our study to present policy insights. So our objectives are to measure the relative efficiency of Indian high courts using data envelopment analysis, and then to present two sort of comparisons of these measurements. So what we do is we make one model in which we determine whether the courts are efficient with respect to their annual inflow of cases, the cases that are instituted during the year, and second, in which we determine which courts are efficient with respect to their total caseload. So the total caseload is basically your pendency at the beginning of the year, number of cases that were beginning at the that are pending at the beginning of the duration that you're studying, and the cases that are instituted during the period of study. So it's basically a summation of both of them, and they represent the overall workload or caseload of the judges. So what is DEA, Data Envelopment Analysis? So what DEA does is it measures the relative efficiency of various homogeneous units known as decision-making units. So in our case, that would be your high courts. And what we're trying to study is measuring the relative efficiency and not the absolute efficiency of the courts. It's a non-parametric linear programming technique. It may be input or output oriented. This I'll explain in the next slide, and it may take up the assumption of constant or variable returns to scale, depending on the study that you're doing. So DEA offers multiple advantages. Firstly, it allows multiple inputs and outputs with varying units of measurement. I think this is the main advantage that DEA offers. It does not require any a priori restrictions on the weights of those inputs and outputs. It allows inclusion of extraneous factors in the study, provides additional information for the inefficient DMUs, and does not require any assumptions about the production function of our frontier. So in this figure, you can see, just one second. Right, so we have our inputs and our outputs. These are your CRS and VRS frontiers. What these are, they're basically a production function that are made of the efficient units. So suppose I have 24 high courts that I've studied over here. Of these, I found that 4 of them are efficient. So these 4 are the ones that are making up this efficient frontier. What they represent is the maximum level of output that you're able to create for a level of input, or the minimum level of input that is required to produce a given level of output. These are your efficient units. So on this VRS frontier, A, B, and C are your efficient units. These form the VRS frontier. Also, you can see it's taking a shape of an envelope. So hence the name Data Envelopment Analysis. We have another unit D that is actually an inefficient unit. So what we can do is we have to so D is capable of coming onto this frontier, but either it will have to increase its output to come to this frontier, or it will have to reduce its input at the same level of output to come to the frontier. In case of output oriented models, it keeps the input level the same and tries to determine how much the output could have been increased had the unit been efficient. This is what it represents, O2. Were we considering the CRS frontier, it would have been O3. If we take on an input oriented model, it will try to reduce the input for a given level of output O1 and try to come over here to join the frontier. So basically the unit D is inefficient, and it can be brought to the frontier by increasing the output for same level of input. That is your output oriented model, and it can be brought to this point over here if we were trying to reduce the input to maintain our level of output. So I will not be going into the mathematical formulation of DEA. I've just presented them over here in terms of their primal and dual forms, their multiplier and envelopment form. So what our DEA models do? So firstly, we take output-oriented VRS models in our study. Output-oriented because we have a given level of input, that is the number of cases that are, say, instituted during the year, and we are trying to maximize our output, that is the number of cases that are disposed during the year. Secondly, we are studying 24 DMUs, that is our 24 high courts during the given time period of 2015 to 2018. We've studied for a 3-year period. We've classified the cases into 2 broad categories, civil and criminal. And we've collated the data from the annual reports that are published by the Supreme Court of India. Now, one of the main things that is important while measuring efficiency using DA is to choose suitable input and output variables that are relevant from a policy perspective. And secondly, we cannot, take a very high number of input and output variables, because as the number of variables would increase with for the same number of DEMUs, the discriminatory power of the model will reduce. So for our case, we've made 3 models. In the first model, we do not consider the inflow of cases at all. We only consider the staff and judges. That is our human resources that are involved in the courts. The outputs are the same for all 3 models. That is the number of civil and criminal cases disposed. For model 2, we take, in addition to judges and staff, we take the number of civil and criminal cases instituted. For model 3, we take the caseload of civil and criminal cases. Caseload, you'll recall, as I said, that it meant the summation of the cases that are instituted or filed during the year, plus the cases that were pending at the beginning of the year. Now, why we have used 3 models is not to choose the best model amongst all of them, but basically to conduct the analysis using different models so that we can, make appropriate policy insights, take appropriate policy insights from these models. We can compare the models to understand where the court is lagging, where it is underperforming, and aim our interventions in those specific areas. So I've just presented a little bit of the data regarding judicial vacancies and performance of courts. So over here, we have the red lines that are representative of the working judge strength, and the yellow portion that is the vacancies in the courts. Right. So we can see obviously vacancies are a huge proportion of the actual sanction strength. In fact, it is almost 38% on an average for all high courts across India during this time period. Coming to the performance of high courts, we've represented the performance currently in 2 terms, clearance rate and congestion rate. Clearance rate, as we said, we need high clearance rates to clear at least a portion of the backlog. However, we'll see that most of them do not have very high clearance rates. In fact, only 2 courts had clearance rates above 1, that was Guwahati and Orissa. Now, congestion rate is basically the number of pending cases at the beginning of the year divided by the number of disposed cases. It represents the number of years that the judiciary will take to clear its pendency, assuming that it continues to work at its given level of performance. So we'll see that, a very high congestion rate is of course bad. For example, in Hyderabad, it has a congestion rate of almost 5. So it means it will take 5 years if it were to clear all of its pendency, assuming that it continues to dispose cases at the current rate. Coming to the results of our models, we'll see from the model 1, in which we did not consider the inflow of cases at all. There is relatively low efficiency. There are only 7 or 6 efficient courts. The average technical efficiencies are low, and the minimum efficiency scores are also quite low. So based on this model, we tried to determine the relationship of efficiency scores with caseload per judge. We found that they actually have a positive relationship between the two, meaning that courts with a higher caseload per judge actually had higher technical efficiency scores. What we interpreted was that, maybe judges are feeling more pressurized to resolve a higher number of cases, and that is why the efficiency scores are improving. But it definitely indicated the need to consider this inflow of cases while measuring performance, and hence we developed models 2 and 3. Model 2 was developed just to check whether the courts are able to efficiently manage their inflow of cases, at least their annual inflow of cases, let alone their pendency. Model 3 was used to incorporate the aspect of pendency and to determine whether the courts were efficiently handling their caseload as well or not. Based on our analysis, we also saw that there are potential improvements that are possible in case for all the high courts under all the three models. So the first model, we can see that there is a high potential for improvement in the disposals. In the second model, it is relatively lower, meaning that the courts are probably able to handle the cases being instituted each year quite well. Again, in model 3, the percentage number may not be very high, but the absolute figures are quite high. So the courts are actually capable of performing well even at their current judicial strength. I mean, no doubt that judicial resources are an issue. They need to be increased. That is a major factor that is clogging the Indian judicial system, but it is definitely not the only factor. Other improvements are also needed. To highlight these improvements and to understand the areas where these improvements need to be made, we've presented a comparison between models 2 and 3. So the second model was only for the annual inflow and the third was for the total caseload. So based on this, we can see that there are certain courts that are efficient in both scenarios, such as Guwahati and Allahabad. There are certain courts that are efficient in neither model, such as Himachal Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh. We can see they have efficiency scores below 100. There are certain courts that are only efficient in one model. For example, Delhi, it's only efficient when it comes to model 3, but not for model 2. And for example, we have Jammu and Kashmir that is efficient in model 2, but not in model 3. Based on these comparisons between between the efficiency models for 2 and 3, we are able to put the courts into 4 quadrants. So the first quadrant is where the courts are efficient in both models, model 2 as well as 3. So what these courts are doing, they're performing relatively well in case of both instituted cases as well as handling their pending cases. So they need to continue their good performance, put better performance checks in place to enable, sustained good performance, and they can act as peers for the inefficient courts so that the inefficient courts can learn from them and adopt their policies and practices to improve their performance. In case of codes that are efficient in Model 3 but are not efficient in Model 2, they need to be studied in greater detail to identify the actual cause behind their congestion. Maybe the codes are highly congested due to lack of resources, lack of funding, or there's an issue involved in their case processes or procedures. Coming to the codes that are efficient in neither model, they need serious interventions for long-term and short-term improvements. In case of short-term improvements, they can focus on They can focus on adding additional temporary judges to clear the backlog of cases. They can put better case management practices in place. They will eventually need to improve their judicial strength also, because since they're not able to handle their inflow of cases, their annual inflow of cases, in the long run, when the cases will keep rising, they will definitely need to enhance their judicial strength. Lastly, there are courts that are efficient in Model 2 but not in Model 3. They are able to handle the inflow of cases annually, but they are not able to deal with their backlog, their pending cases. So they need different practices, more short-term interventions in place, such as additional judges, temporary judges, and better case management practices to improve their judicial performance. In conclusion, one can say that the performance of courts can be improved even with the existing judicial strength. I mean, no doubt judicial strength has to be increased eventually, but the courts are capable of performing better with the current strength as well. Apart from this, there are improvements that are needed, broad long-term goals to ensure that the courts are able to manage their annual inflow of cases, specific reforms that are aimed at reducing pendency, study and learn from courts that are efficient, ensure regular performance checks, especially for the good performing courts, study case laws and court procedures to understand where the case is taking maximum time, where there's a bottleneck that needs to be resolved so that the cases can flow easily through the system. And lastly, there is a need for better allocation of judicial resources, whether that be in terms of financial resources or in terms of existing judges, staff, and infrastructure. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Mansi. In case of any questions, I request you all to please raise your hands. We can take them up one by one. Any questions, anyone? Okay, so in that case, we can end the session now. Thank you, Mansi, for such an informative and wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Adya.
Thank you.
Thank you. Adya,
Yeah, Mansi?
yeah, AGM का कुछ नहीं है ना फिर आज, then I
No,
can
no, no,
everybody
no.
leave then?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks.